So I hope that you guys can all see me, but I'm excited to finally talk about this documentary, The Game Changers. I don't know how many of you watched. If you did, let me know in the comments. And I'm curious to hear what you thought of it. I'm going to let you know kind of what I thought about it as a whole, and then also where the science stands on plant-based diets and whether or not a vegan diet is inherently better than an animal protein-based diet and all of that stuff. We'll also talk a little bit about soy if we get a chance and different sources of protein. I'll give everyone a second to get on. Let's see, what can I tell you? So I've been pretty busy. Things have been good. Business has been good. So I've had less time to be on Instagram, which sometimes stresses me out because I like to be present and making sure that I'm interacting with all of you. But so I did this live call with my group program last night called The Real Method, but I wanted to give you guys like more of the clip notes and condensed version and see if we can talk about this in more of a conversational way. Yes, I will save this live as long as Instagram allows me to. Once in a while it gets finicky, but I always try to save the lives so that you guys can watch it. Okay, so The Game Changers. For those of you who haven't watched it yet, let me just give a quick little synopsis. It's a documentary. It's on Netflix. And it tells the story of James Wilk, who is a retired UFC fighter, and he's also an elite special forces trainer. So basically, he got injured, and he decided to basically travel the world to find out what would be the best diet for optimal health and optimal athletic performance. So this documentary really had a big focus on athletic performance, and I think that some of it got mixed up with that too, because an optimal diet for athletic performance doesn't necessarily mean an optimal diet for everyday common Joe, you and I. That being said, there's also a lot to be said for overall health, and they did kind of go into certain things. They talked about the effect of a plant-based diet versus an animal protein-based diet on cardiovascular disease markers like cholesterol and triglycerides. They even went as far as to talk about whether or not it allows men to hold an erection longer. So go figure, who knew? So anyway, I'm going to dive in. So if you see me looking down, it's because I have like 9 pages of notes with sources cited. So that said, if I do mention anything, and if I say according to a study or according to research, I do have all the studies. So if you want to see any of them in particular, I can share them with you if you do come from a science background, or if you are interested in looking at any of the studies that I'm going to talk about. Some of them are the studies that were either cited or used or referred to in the film. So I have been able to dig most of those up. So let's talk about just documentaries in general when they come to health. There's been a few over the years. So What the Health was a very big one. There's been a bunch of keto diet documentaries, Fork Over Knives, basically a ton of documentaries. And if you realize by now, all of them have an agenda. And we all, as healthcare providers and as general population, everyone has inherent biases. Yes, the magic pill, that was the keto documentary, right? We all have inherent biases. And some of them are, I would like to say that most of my biases or my bias does come from evaluating all the evidence available, evaluating how that evidence pertains to me as an individual and each of my individual clients, and then making a judgment call. So I will say my own personal way of eating is that I do eat animal products. I don't eat fish because I don't like it. It's very, very healthy, but I just don't personally like it. Again, I don't eat a lot of red meat because I don't love a lot of red meat. And there are, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of meat and the differences between lean and fatty meats and all of that. But I prefer a lean protein because I get more bang for my buck. When I work with clients, I primarily focus on caloric intake and macronutrient ratio, so getting enough protein to sustain that caloric deficit and ensure that you're preserving lean muscle mass. But as someone who has lost weight and kept it off myself, and as someone who exercises, I also find that the easiest way for me to adhere to a diet and stay full and stay satisfied and support my exercise is by including lean animal proteins. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with a vegan diet. There are a lot of great things about a vegan diet, and I would say that most of us would agree, if any of us healthcare people can agree on anything, that we should be eating more fruits and actually, I take that back, because some people would say we shouldn't be eating more fruit, but that we should be eating more plants, at least more vegetables and more fiber. So we're in agreement on there. But when I look at my choices and when I look at the best diet for my clients, if someone came to me and they said, and this happens all the time, they said they want to start a plant-based diet. I'll usually ask them why. So I'll try to get to the bottom line of what their reasoning is for wanting to be on a plant-based diet. Oftentimes it'll be something like this. I saw this documentary and I'm really convinced that this is the best way for me to be eating, or I heard that you can lose weight, but they won't have these real strong reason themselves for wanting to be on the diet. And if you don't have a strong ethical reason for being on a vegan diet, it's going to be very hard for you to do it long term, because it is harder. It is more limited. It is harder to honestly eat in a deficit for the most part without including animal protein. Of course you can do it, but it is harder. So it has to be something that really means a lot to you. And I hope that after today we can talk about the pros and cons of both, and you can make a more educated decision. And it's always okay to try something. I think that what you want to stay away from is saying that you are 100% plant-based or 100% anything, really, because then you can't go back from it and you seem like that person who jumps from diet to diet. What you could say is, yeah, I'm experimenting with intermittent fasting right now. You don't live and die by it. It doesn't mean anything about who you are, but you're experimenting to see if it might make you feel better. So same thing with plants. I'm experimenting with incorporating more plants in my diet and more plant-based sources of protein. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, Merle. So a good documentary will present both sides of the equation. Will present both sides of the science, and I will try to do that today. This documentary did not. And after looking through even some of the stuff that they cited, it actually was overwhelmingly obvious how biased this documentary is. So when we talk about scientific research, you might hear the word cherry picking. So what cherry picking basically is when someone is trying to prove a point. So for example, in this documentary, they are trying to say that a plant-based diet is inherently better than an animal-based diet. They cherry pick studies to make it fit their agenda. So what's frustrating about nutrition research is that most of it is pretty inconclusive. We have a study that says keto's good and a study that says keto's bad, right? And we have a study that says that high meat consumption might lead to chronic inflammation, and one that says the opposite. Same thing with soy. So we have to be careful when we use nutrition research. We have to first of all make sure we're looking at the highest quality research, typically randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses. That's going to be the best research. Of course, we can look at anecdotal research. They did that to a pretty great extent in this documentary, and we'll get into that. But you can basically prove any argument that you want by picking the research that fits your agenda. So that's what cherry picking means. And I think that what I felt positive about seeing is when you do look at most people in the nutrition world, whether they are vegan themselves or not, have gone out and said, this is a biased documentary. So when you're looking for information, don't go to your friends about it for something like this. Go to some doctors. There are some doctors that are better than others. Go to trusted healthcare professionals to kind of give you the bottom line and do your own research. Okay, so like I said, a vegan diet can be very healthy if done correctly, and so can an animal-based diet, and I'm going to show you why. So the first thing that people like to bring up, and this can go both ways, is financial support and funding. So the fact that James Cameron, the director of this movie, has a vegan protein company. Arnold Schwarzenegger has a company called Ladder, which sells vegan supplements, and Jackie Chan is vegan and all that stuff. So that's not to say that just because these people have ties to the vegan businesses means that it's bad. But what bothered me so much is, first of all, they don't ever disclose that. And when you are putting out a piece of scientific information, if you look at any research study, at the bottom it's going to say who paid for that research, if there was any financial disclosures. If you go to a conference, so if I go to our big nutrition conference, Fancy, if the speaker is being paid or has any kind of financial ties to any kind of company that might be important to disclose, they do have to say this. So this stuff was not disclosed, and that bothers me for a few reasons like I just mentioned. But it also really bothers me because some of their criticism of the animal protein research is that it was conducted by big meat or big dairy. Meanwhile, some of the research that they presented in the documentary was also funded by like big avocado. So it's not to say that, first of all, funding doesn't necessarily mean anything. You can have an avocado study funded by avocado that's very well done, but it is something that should be disclosed. Okay. So like when people say, oh, that was funded by aspartame or that was funded by Diet Coke, of course it was, because no one else wants to prove their point more than they do. But if you look at the methods used in the study, if they check out, then okay. If it's a poorly done study, then you want to look at it. So here's my personal bias. There was not one RD who was called to speak on any of this, a nutrition documentary. Not one nutrition expert was called to speak in this documentary. There was one RD that they quickly featured. They flashed to an RD who was on a clip on the Today Show or something, and they showed her saying that animal protein is not bad. And then they cut her off and they say, wow, can you believe that? These people are recommending that we eat more animals. And it was just so ridiculous. Anyway, so that kind of annoyed me. So interesting that happened. They did feature a bunch of different doctors in the film. So Dr. Dean Ornish, Dr. Aaron Spitz, Dr. Robert Vogel, etc. All of them who have time and time again aligned themselves with a vegan diet or have sold a vegan diet. I think that's really irresponsible. I think it's irresponsible to say there's any one best diet for everyone, because there's not, because there's so many factors, as I said, from socioeconomic status to preference. I don't like tofu. I don't like beans. So now what? Doc, what are you going to tell me to eat? How can we say that there's one diet that everyone should be on? We can educate and say, like, these are the pros and cons, but we can't say that there's just one best diet. Okay, so let's go point by point through a few things. So historical background. So they start out early in the film talking about the fact that gladiators were plant-based. So they cut to this citation, which was an article talking about the fact that the gladiators did eat a lot of plant-based foods. But upon looking further into it, when they looked up like the fossils, they found that actually there was nitrogen found in those samples that they dug up, which means that, so nitrogen is a breakdown product of protein, so of animal protein. So they were eating some animal protein. And then when they further dug into this and looked and talked to experts in gladiators, I guess, they found that actually gladiators were given a high carb diet to fatten them up, because it made for a more interesting show and they were being stabbed to death. So were they plant-based by choice? Yeah, because gladiators were considered the dregs of society and you weren't going to waste meat on them. So does it mean that, again, does that disprove the fact that plant-based diet is bad? No, it just doesn't prove that because gladiators ate plants that what is that even, who cares? They ate plants because no one wanted to give them a filet mignon. But again, it doesn't prove anything either way, but was sort of packaged in a way that was really convincing. If you go back and look at it, And what's really funny is that they actually had a quote from the author of the study, Fabian Cans, who actually is on record as saying that the vegetarian diet that the gladiators ate had nothing to do with poverty or animal rights. Actually, it seems that gladiators were fat. Consuming a lot of simple carbohydrates such as barley and legumes like beans was designed for survival in the arena. Packing the carbs also packed on the pounds. Gladiators needed subcutaneous fat. A fat cushion protects you from cut wounds and shields nerves and blood vessels in a fight. That's not to say that carbs make you fat either. That eating a vegan diet is going to make you fat. But we're going to talk about protein quality in a little bit. In order to meet your protein needs out of a plant-based diet, you're going to need more of this stuff, which is going to mean that you're probably going to need to take in more calories. That being said, when they look at plant-based diets overall, it seems that on average, people on plant-based diets take in 600 calories fewer than people on animal-based diets. Great, that's an average. But if you are a person who's aware of how much you're eating, you can control that. So, okay, this next part drove me absolutely insane. And I know a lot of you guys who are laughing. I know Raquel and Caitlin, and you guys are going to agree that this is crazy. So they start talking about endurance exercise and endurance athletes. And they talk about how it doesn't make, why are we giving athletes protein to fuel them? And that's where they really lost me, because no one gives an endurance athlete protein to fuel their exercise. No one does that. What do you eat the night before a marathon? Or what do you eat the night before a soccer game in high school, right? You go to a pasta party and you eat carbs. Carbs is the preferred source of energy for your body. Your body wants carbs to run on. So when you're going to exercise, you better bet that if you eat more carbohydrates, you're going to be a better endurance athlete. You're going to have more endurance. So there are arguments on the keto side that can you be an endurance athlete on keto? You can, as my husband said, you can find a freak anywhere you go. Yeah, you can find endurance athletes who eat keto. Usain Bolt ate 100 chicken nuggets a day when he performed in the Beijing Olympics. That guy is the fastest guy in the world, but probably an outlier. So none of this is indisputable proof of anything. So they talk about how, they're going back to like the meathead type of stereotype of athletes and protein, but what they're not realizing is that endurance athletes never really prioritize protein, although there is research to say that endurance athletes do have higher protein needs. But if you're going to be running, you better bet that you're going to have full glycogen stores. And in order to do that, you do need carbohydrates. So that was just, again, it almost seemed like it was thrown in there to confuse people. So there are definitely many athletes who can perform well on a vegan diet, as this film shows. In fact, I'm sure if you run endurance events that it's going to be helpful to be eating a higher carbohydrate diet. But they didn't show anything in the middle. They showed people on like a high carb, low protein diet versus a high protein, low carb. They never said what would happen if you took 3 athletes and one of them was just fueled properly with a nice balance of both, right? So that drove me crazy. Okay. Another claim that animal protein increases inflammation. And I see this one all the time. I actually see that everything causes inflammation according to Instagram. So we're all going to die. What is inflammation? So no one says protein fuels your workouts. If your trainer is telling you to drink a protein shake to get ready for an endurance event, then get a new trainer. So, okay, animal protein increases inflammation. So what is inflammation? Inflammation is actually a very important and natural process in the body. There's also a difference between acute inflammation, which is temporary, and chronic inflammation, which is chronic and sustained and is dangerous. So what's an example of acute inflammation? Let's say you go get a workout. You're lifting, you're going to Orange Theory, let's say. So you're running, you're doing a little weightlifting. What happens after a workout? Your body is in a period of repair. It's also inflamed. So after a workout, your inflammatory markers are high. But we also know that research shows that exercise decreases inflammation in the long term. So when we look at people who exercise, yes, they're inflamed after they exercise, but over time, that exercise, which creates acute inflammation, actually decreases chronic inflammation. So when you look at, so they started to look at what meat does to inflammation. So this is where you may have heard, I've said it before, but you'll see a lot of people in the science world say correlation does not equal causation. So what is a correlation and why do we say this? It's because, as I said before, as great as nutrition research might be, it's very hard to prove anything. And that's why when everyone's so confused, it's because you can't really prove certain things. And part of that has to do with just the fact that we can't put people on a diet that might not be good for them and see if they die. So we can't take, we can do that to rats. So we can give rats like 25 steaks and see what happens to them. But we can't do that. We can't say like, hey, Nadia, I'm gonna give you like an overdose of meat every day for the next 30 years and let's see what happens to your heart, because that we can't do that. So it's very difficult to test things in nutrition, because let's say we have a cohort of people. Let's say we're looking at, does red meat cause cardiovascular disease? What's very difficult, let's say we have a 30-year study. So we're following these people every couple years. We're checking in with them and we're checking their blood. We're seeing their weight. We're taking a dietary recall. How do we know? So they tell us that they eat meat, how much meat they eat. But how do we know if the reason that they're getting chronic inflammation is because they're a smoker, or because they live in an area with pollution, or because they don't exercise, or because they sit a lot, or because they don't drink water? Or there's so many factors. So to say that specifically, it is very, very difficult for us to draw those conclusions. So why is this data useless? No, it does give us hypotheses that we can then test in further studies, but it is absolutely not a be-all, end-all. And when we can start to, what's really important for us to look at is what is the mechanism. So for a vegan diet, if they say, if for this documentary, I say that animal protein causes chronic inflammation, my question is how? And they'll say, well, research studies show. No, how? What's actually happening in the body that over time I'm going to get chronic inflammation? And it's like, well, people who eat a lot of meat also drink a lot of wine, and they also eat a lot of cream spinach, and they also eat a lot of potatoes, and they also don't exercise. And it's like, well, then it's not the meat. It could be all these other factors. So I would like to see a study where they take a bunch of girls from SoulCycle, they rip them off their SoulCycle bike, and they give them a filet mignon, a 3-ounce filet mignon and asparagus with a sweet potato every day for 3 years, and see what happens to them. So a lot of times, like, these studies are not done in moderate cases. So it's the extremes. Okay. So there is some evidence that subbing red meat for soy protein subbing soy protein in place of red meat can reduce inflammation. But the study is looking at like very high fat red meat, so a very fatty burger, and swapping it for soy protein. So the question comes down to, is it the caloric intake that really ultimately governs all these changes, or is it specifically something in the meat? And so when the study's controlled for BMI, so let's say everyone is the same BMI, then it doesn't pan out. Red meat intake is no longer correlated with inflammation. So how can we separate these two? And that's really important to look at. So in an overall healthy person, if we're talking about everything else is the same, and the only difference is someone has 100 calories from red meat versus 100 calories from soy, who's going to do better? And it's this, what we see is it's not different. So it's important to look at those individual factors. Okay, and to say, again, this was also, I'm not saying that this study is perfect either. A study looked at the inflammatory response to vegan cheese versus regular cheese. So they gave overweight people either cheddar cheese, regular cheddar cheese, or a vegan cheese, and they looked at inflammatory response. the group that had the vegan cheese had a higher increase in CRP, C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker. Again, that doesn't really mean anything because, as I just said, acute inflammation does not determine chronic inflammation. But if you want to take shitty studies and say they mean something, then I'm going to show you a shitty study with vegan cheese. Okay. Of course, that was not in the documentary. Next. Animal protein and cancer. Next order of business, animal protein and cancer. So while studies have shown that fatty meats are associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease through total cholesterol and LDL, lean meats do not have the same effect on increasing blood lipids. So when we're looking at these really fatty meats, this is an issue. There's a very big difference between an 80% ground beef and a 96% ground beef. And if you want to know the difference, if you scroll back through my feed later, I can share it. You can see the difference. And calorically, it's a big difference. Saturated fat content is very different and protein content is very different. So, you can't say that all of these types of red meat are the same. Or let's not even talk about red meat. Let's talk about chicken and fish, which we'll talk about in a second. So there's equal evidence that fish and fatty sources of fish such as salmon, which have the essential fat omega-3, can decrease cardiovascular disease risk. I'm sure many of you have heard of the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, which is highly dependent on fish intake. So when those studies look at things, well, how come they're not showing that this is an issue? How come they're showing that fish intake and animal protein decrease risk? Again, you can't, as I said on my call last night, you can't take the American out of America. So when we say, oh, I'm going to do the Mediterranean diet, meanwhile, we're working 16 hours a day, we don't get up, we don't exercise and all this stuff. Yeah, we can't just pour olive oil all over our food and think that we're going to get the same benefits. But still, if we're looking at studies in a vacuum, this is what they say. Okay. They did start talking about something with that animal protein can make your cells more rapidly multiply, which anyone who has had cancer, who has a family member with cancer, is scary AF to think that if I eat animal protein, am I putting myself at risk at greater risk for cancer? And so the amino acid leucine can stimulate mTOR. But just like inflammation, this only lasts for a few hours after eating it before it returns to baseline. So yes, that is associated with cancer when you're looking at chronic levels or being elevated for a long time. So we talked about exercise. So yes. Now on to more just stupid or faulty arguments that don't really mean much, that are more dramatic. So they have Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor in a fight, right? So Nate Diaz is a vegan and Conor McGregor, they show him leading up to the fight eating tons of steak. And they make a point to show that. So basically, Nate Diaz wins the fight, and the film basically says, well, of course he did. He's vegan. That's why he won the fight. What they haven't said is that on the rematch, Conor McGregor won. So now what? That's just so, it means nothing. Anyway, they didn't talk about the training. They didn't talk about that Diaz was a little bit skinnier and he could get underneath them and all this stuff. And then I mentioned Usain Bolt and his chicken nuggets. So they look at very elite level vegan athletes and talk about how successful they are. And like I said, you can find vegan athletes, meat-based athletes, these carnivore athletes, those people are crazy too. No offense if you are, but you're a little crazy. So you can find exceptions to every rule. And if you care enough to live that lifestyle, then you will go out of your way to make sure it's balanced and find a way to do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. Like I said, Usain Bolt ate 100 chicken nuggets a day at the Beijing Olympics, and he's doing just fine. So Jordan's diet, I think, is a really great idea. For those of you who don't follow him or didn't follow along with his Big Mac challenge, he ate a Big Mac every day for 30 days, but he stayed in a caloric deficit because what he wanted to show was that no one food can make you fat, and that ultimately weight loss, no matter what anyone wants to say, and I will argue this until the grave, because I just don't, it's just physics, that you need to be in a caloric deficit to lose weight. I'm not saying that there's different outputs and there's nothing that affects the calories out equation, but whatever your caloric deficit is, you have to be in one to lose weight. So he wanted to show that he can find a way to fit that in his diet, in an overall healthy diet, and still lose weight. And the reason he specifically chose the Big Mac was to be in opposition to the film Super Size Me, which is another documentary that was extremely, extremely biased. So basically, that documentary was, he wanted to show that if he ate McDonald's every day that he would get sick. So what he did was he set out to eat McDonald's every day. He supersized every meal. He ate it for every single meal. He ate in a caloric surplus, and he purposely stopped exercising. So yeah, idiot, what do you think is going to happen to you? No one can just be normal in this world. So no one can just be in the middle. So I'm pointing to all the scientific evidence of veganism on both sides. And again, I'm just applying it to a general population. Like I said, when you account for a BMI and you account for a caloric intake, there really isn't that big of a difference. And you have to look at overall dietary patterns. So yes, like you can absolutely be very healthy on a vegan diet, but a lot of people don't care enough to do it in a healthy way, quite frankly. Like most people are going to go about it in a very unhealthy way, because if you don't really care that much about the ethics behind it, it is very hard for someone who grew up as a meat eater to switch. So in that point, if you're eating, again, like there's no magic to it. You have to be eating mostly plants, and you have to be eating mostly like lean sources of protein, and you have to be eating more protein. So if you're looking at vegan diets, they do tend to be deficient in protein and deficient in quality protein. But that said, you can absolutely get enough protein. You just have to be more aware of it, and most people, quite frankly, are just not going to be. So we have to look at also like practicality. So for a general population. Okay, so here's the other, this is just absolutely ludicrous. A peanut butter sandwich has as much protein as a 3-ounce steak or 3 large eggs. I mean, anyone can go to Google and can look this up. Okay, so 3 eggs, I'm gonna do 3 large eggs, so 70 calories each, 210 calories, 15 grams of fat, 18 grams of protein. So 3 ounces of steak, again, we can look at a lean sirloin or we can look at a really fatty steak. But if we're going to look at a lean sirloin, 3 ounces of steak is 150 calories, 5 grams of fat, and 26 grams of protein. Now, if we look at 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, which I'm being fair, because most people are not going to make a peanut butter sandwich with just 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, but we'll give it to them. 200 calories, 2 grams of, 200 calories, 16 grams of fat, 6 carbs, 8 protein. And we'll say 2 slices of bread. I'll estimate them at 100 calories each, because that's pretty much in the middle. And so let's say we take that 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, the 2 slices of bread. We now have a 400 calorie sandwich. We have 18 grams of fat. We have 34 grams of carbs, and we have 16 grams of protein. So not only do we have more than double the calories of a 3 ounces of steak, we also have triple the fat. We have 34 times the amount of carbs, and we have less protein. So when we're controlling for these things, you can't escape that it comes down to how much you're actually eating. And in order to get 26 grams of protein in this meal, you're going to have to eat actually 4 tablespoons of peanut butter, which is going to bring you up to 600 calories, which is a shit ton of food for a little sandwich. Again, you have to be aware of that. So, vegan diets in the research are deficient in protein. I have the studies if you want to see them. That's not to say that most people, in the research it is. And again, same thing, there's a lot of issues with the research. Many people can get enough protein on a vegan diet if they try. It's absolutely possible. But vegan diets, they here, vegans get on average 14% of their calories from protein, which for most people, especially for an athlete, is very low. And when you are getting that low of protein, the quality of your protein becomes more important. And because plant-based proteins are less, they have a lower protein digestibility score, you're going to need more of them. So, for example, if I'll look at the protein digestibility score of, let's look at lentils, because I think that's what they used. So, on average, animal-based protein is digested at a 90% or higher rate, while plant proteins range anywhere from 55 to 80%. So soy is going to be on the higher end of digestibility. About 80% is digestible. And then on the lower end, something like wheat gluten is going to be 55%, which will mean like you almost need double the amount to get the amino acids, basically. So again, not to say that you can't do it, but you do have to be more aware. And the general population watching this documentary, being influenced by it, have no idea what any of this even means. And that's what gets me. Okay, so with this, so plant versus animal proteins. So like I said, plant and animal proteins are 10 to 40% less bioavailable than animal proteins, depending on the source. Most of them do not contain essential amino acids. That being said, you can combine different sources of plant proteins to get a full amino acid profile. Most plant proteins are low in leucine. Leucine is the amino acid that we look at for stimulating muscle protein synthesis, so you want to be aware of that. If you eat enough total protein from a variety of plant sources, you can absolutely make up for these limitations. So it's not to say that you can't on a plant-based diet. It's just, it takes more work and it takes more awareness. What they show all these strongman athletes, but when you look at Patrick Baboumian's diet, he drinks 4 protein shakes to hit his protein needs. Again, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with a protein shake, but the majority of people aren't really going to be able to hit their protein needs easily. And I'm saying that especially from working with clients, it's very difficult. So then the burrito experiment. So they took the 3 players from the Miami Dolphins and they gave them a vegan burrito, a chicken burrito, and a beef burrito. And basically they want to look at like what is the quality of their blood after. So they take the blood and then they put it in a centrifuge. So basically they spin it. I don't know. Again, of course, this is not a validated scientific experiment, so the methodology is escaping me here. But when they take the blood out, they show the different little things of blood and they said, look at this. Look at the vegan serum. It's so much more clear than the animal serum. Well, you know how your doctors tell you to fast before a blood test? The reason for that is because when you are not fasted, you can have chylomicrons, which is the way that fat is packaged in the blood, so in the serum. So the reason that their blood was cloudy has more to do with the fact that the animal protein burritos had more fat in them. You don't need to have, you can make a burrito that is very low fat. I do it all the time, but I'm also aware of what I'm doing. So yeah, sure, most people who are going to get a burrito are not doing that, but you absolutely can. So the thing is to say that they have to have an even caloric content and fat content for this to be a fair experiment. So what is that called? So it's called postprandial lipemia. And this is exactly why your doctors tell you to fast before a blood test, because if you're not, that's when you get like a falsely elevated triglyceride or a falsely elevated cholesterol number, because when you just have eaten fat, it's going to remain in your blood. So again, why is this study in here? To confuse people, I guess, and maybe if they got a few people with it. But I don't know how they didn't see that everyone was going to go after this. I can't find one. I really haven't found like one scientific analysis on the internet that could really argue any of these points. I have yet to see it, so I don't know how they thought that this was going to fly. But anyway. Okay. The study that they cited on this, okay? This is crazy. The study that they cited on the burrito thing again, there's no methodology because it's not a validated study, but they looked at different foods, and they looked at how different foods raise your triglycerides. Olive oil had the same rise in triglycerides as cheesecake and a hamburger and fries. Olive oil is vegan, but it's very high in fat, and that's what you have to understand. When everything is controlled, it's all the same. Your body doesn't care where it's coming from. So what it comes down to is it easier to stay healthy when you're eliminating meat. For some people it is. For other people, it's harder. Like I said, you're going to require more food to get the same quality of protein. They also found that salmon, which is an animal protein, had half the rise in triglycerides when compared with olive oil. So you tell me. I don't know. Okay, so what they could have said. So they could have said that they could have used this film and said, look at all these amazing vegan athletes. You can be on a well-formulated vegan diet and still perform well and have great lab work and feel good and look good. What they could say is, we don't need animal protein. We don't need it. But it is a superior source of essential amino acids. We can make that up in plants, but it's superior. What they also could have said is that when you look at the research, vegan diets do have better health outcomes. So I'm not arguing that when you look at the research and they look at these vegan diets, because they're lower in calories and they're controlling for weight, they have better health outcomes. But let's take people let's put everyone in the same pool, eating the same amount of calories, eating at the same BMI in the same group, and let's study them. Let's not cherry pick here. Okay, so I'm almost done. Okay. Ethical reasons. This I'm going to say very, very little about because this is not my MO. This is not my strong point, and I understand there's a ton of ethical reasons to not eat meat, and I'm not going to argue that because I think, if anything, that would probably have been the most valid thing to talk about, and there are environmental reasons. I will say, though, that they cited an environmental reason that was just completely off base. So they said that they claimed that emissions from meat production are more than all of the total forms of transportation in the world combined. Quick Google search at statistics will show you that actually meat production accounts for about 3% of the USA's greenhouse gas emissions, while transportation makes up 80%. How do they even say that? It's 3% versus 80%. So yes, does meat contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? Yes, about 3%. But if you're driving an Escalade and you're eating Beyond Burgers, then really, what are we doing here? So yes, it is a big difference, and maybe if I was a better person, I would want to do my part. But I guess I'm not convinced that that's big enough. It's going to make a big enough difference. But I also don't know what the long-term sustainability and all of that stuff is. If, let's say, the whole world switched over to a vegan diet, now we need to be making even more protein to hit our protein needs. Can we grow that much stuff? Who knows? I don't know. So that's not my thing. But if someone is an expert on that, I would love to talk to them, maybe have them on my podcast and have a conversation, because I think that's very valid. Okay, so... Okay, I think I talked about all of this. One thing that I did want to say, because people are going to ask, is, well, if I do a vegan diet, isn't soy bad for you? And I will say that no, soy is not bad for you. It's actually very misunderstood. So I picked these up at Fancy, actually, just looking at some of the research between soy and breast cancer and soy and women's health. Hey, Desi. I got these. So basically, the soy thing I think scares a lot of people, because isoflavones, which is a compound in soy, is a phytoestrogen. So people will say that is something that could give you man boobs and can decrease testosterone and could cause breast cancer. But the research does not show that at all. In fact, it actually shows that soy might be protective against breast cancer. So let's look. The results of this research are extremely reassuring in that it shows even when isoflavone exposure greatly exceeds typical Japanese intake, which is 40 milligrams per day, breast tissue is not adversely affected. And this is why every single really health group out there says that it's healthy. So the American Institute for Cancer Research and the World Cancer Research Fund concluded that even post-diagnosis, soy intake may improve the survival of women with breast cancer. In 2017, the FDA reconfirmed its position that soy protein is safe. I know everyone hates the FDA, but they're not out to get us. Like, there might be things that we disagree with. Heck, like the fact that supplements aren't regulated drives me nuts, but they're not like trying to kill the entire population. It's just not what's happening. And thank you. I'm so glad you liked this analysis because I'm all jazzed up about it. So yeah, anyway, clinical data in men indicates that soy does not affect estrogen levels. 47 clinical trials found no effective soy or isoflavone intervention on estradiol and other reproductive hormones in pre- and postmenopausal women. So safe to say that soy, I mean, like, if you want to limit it for your own personal beliefs, you can, but it's safe, especially at like amounts that we would really consume, especially as part of an animal-based diet. But even on a vegan diet, it should only, you should be getting a variety of sources. Soy is going to be the highest digestible vegan protein, so it is going to be something that you're going to want to prioritize more over some of the others. But you could feel pretty safe with that. So, flax and soy. I haven't heard the flax argument, but I could look into that. So soy and GMO, that is a whole other topic, which I'll get jazzed up on. But GMO is not bad. So I highly recommend for GMO information the account Food Science Babe, and the book Food Bullying and Food Truths is her first book by Michelle Payne. Also someone that I met at Fancy. She's both a farmer and she has a PhD in nutrition and is very, very active in the education about why GMOs are not necessarily a bad thing and are actually incredibly important for our food supply and are something that's really been around in genetic engineering, is something that's been going on for a very long time. It just has been called something else. It could be called crossbreeding, like those Honeycrisp apples. Even if they're organic, Honeycrisp apples were not like found naturally. Like they are not just found like that. No, Food Babe is an idiot, and I'm sorry, but I have to say it. So Food Babe is what I'd say is a completely fear-mongering account. So Food Science Babe is sort of like her alter ego, and she'll post about a lot of the actual science. So Food Babe has been on this crusade for years to call out food companies for using ingredients that aren't ever proven to be bad, and they sound scary because most people don't understand them. So I think that I'm going to do more on this topic because I have been very passionate about it, especially lately, because I think that like the fear of food is one of the most dangerous things. And I think it's taking us away from the actual bottom line of like just an overall healthy diet can include Doritos that have like the cheese powder on them. Like they're not going to kill you. Actually, being afraid of them is probably more unhealthy than eating them once in a while. But all of us will agree that an overall healthy diet should include fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, whether that's animal or plant-based, fiber, whole grains, all of these things. And if those make up the bulk of your diet, then we don't really have to get into the weeds about every individual chemical, because that shouldn't be making up the bulk of your diet. And most of us know that and can agree on that. So I think that you always have to look at how much of this am I eating and how much of this would I have to be eating for this to have an actual negative effect on my health. And that's really the most important factor, is like taking into account in the context of your diet, is this something that I have to worry about? So I'm very passionate about that because I hate that people have to be scared of food. And I hate that people have to feel guilty giving their kids like a munchkin if they want it, or, you know, they get shamed for bringing something with gluten into the school class. Like, I think that it's not fair because it's not founded in science. So that's what I have to say about that. And I really don't like calling people out, and that's why, like, trust me, I scroll through Instagram every day and I'm like ready to go off. My husband's probably in the other room like, yeah, I know. But instead what I try to do is just give as much information as I can and let you guys do what you want with it, and like at least be able to look at sort of both sides. Like I said, I had no agenda in telling you not to be scared of certain ingredients other than like the fact that I don't think you should worry about it. If you don't have enough protein from a vegan diet, as long as you have enough calories, nothing necessarily bad is going to happen, but protein is crucial for a lot of different factors, especially for if we're looking at exercise performance, and we're talking about muscle mass. So the RDA, basically, I would say if you could be making sure that you're getting the minimum, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram. So let's say you're, this is going to be hard math for me. So let's say you're like 55 kilograms times 0.8, which is like a little less than 50, what is that, like 45 grams of protein, which isn't very much, quite frankly. So the RDA basically is the minimum amount that they've determined you need to eat to prevent being deficient. So anything below that is considered deficiency, and that's when you'll start to see really negative effects. When we're looking at optimal protein intake, there's a lot of opinions that are based in fact, but I like to recommend like around 1 gram per pound of body weight of protein. So if you were like 130 pounds, about 130 grams of protein for the most part. When you get up to higher, let's say if you get up to like higher weights where you have like higher proportion of body fat, I wouldn't tell someone to eat, like if they were 250 pounds, I wouldn't tell them to eat 250 grams of protein. And I explained this on one of my most recent posts, but then you'd want to use lean body mass. So the negative effects, I mean, just like any kind of deficiency, without protein, there are certain functions in your body that aren't able to be carried out. Proteins are required for a ton of processes in your body. How about General Mills raised their fields with pesticides and everyone online was panicking? Yeah, so I'm not worried about that because pesticides, so the whole glyphosate thing, I did an Instagram live on this a while back and it's on my YouTube channel, the production quality is terrible, but Food Science Babe talks a lot about this and about safe levels of glyphosate and pesticides in our food supply and how much of that you'd really need to be eating for it to become an issue. There's a lot of hate towards Monsanto. I'm not going to say like yes or no, it's founded or unfounded, but we're using less pesticides than we ever have. And the reason why we're creating GMO crops is so that we can use even less pesticides. And so that's why I think it's important for everyone to understand that it's not just because it sounds scary. It might be because you don't understand it. It doesn't mean that it is. So would I not give my kid, I mean, listen, I don't have kids, so I know that like, when it comes down to your kids, you're going to listen to whatever it is that you see. Would I be concerned with it? Not really. Would I also be like feeding my kids Cheerios every day? No, because it's not the most balanced meal either. So I think if you're including it in part of a healthy diet, absolutely wouldn't really worry about it. But all wheat, so wheat in general it's actually really not, it's not common practice for farmers to use glyphosate on wheat except at the end of harvest. So post-harvest, they'll use glyphosate, but it's actually not very common practice. Glyphosate is used on other crops more frequently. But so with the wheat, it's like even if they're using it post-harvest, it's actually like lower residues than most other foods. So again, it's not something that I'm really concerned with it, but like if you go to someone like Food Science Babe and you ask her for the research, she'll give you everything because that's really her jam. And vitamin PhD is another one. She's great too. Jessie Hoffman PhD. I can tag a few people who I would go to for that info. Nadia, it is sad. So people, especially parents, feel that they have to buy the expensive stuff. And they've like looked at this, and like people with food insecurity and people who can't afford organic just don't buy produce because of that. And it's really scary. But if you guys like talking about that, I'll do another session on that. And I'm going to do a podcast episode on that. So I have some fun guests lined up for that. I'm going to wrap this up because otherwise Instagram's going to cut me off. So I'm going to say my goodbye now, but I'll stay here for another minute or two until Instagram cuts me off. I'm going to save this. And like I said, I have the citations if you wanted to see any other research from tonight, or if that's of interest to you. There's a lot of good analysis of the Game Changers documentary out there. I'd say read both. Read like from the vegan perspective, read from the meat perspective, and then make your judgments. But this is like where I'm coming from, and this is how I feel as a dietitian, how I choose to eat based on the overall evidence, and how I feel confident in that. So, you do with it what you will, but don't be unnecessarily scared without looking at the full context of everything. So, what else? 9 o'clock almost. Wow. So tonight was on the Game Changers. There were a few other questions that I didn't get a chance to get to, so maybe this weekend I'll do another live with just general questions about some of the other things that you wanted to see. I know you want a gym tour, so I'll do that this weekend too. I've just been traveling a lot, so my apartment's sort of a mess. But I'll get that cleaned up for you guys and show you. But as always, thank you for joining me. I hope you learned something and enjoyed this, and have a great night.